Square 2 is split into two parts, and this is part 2A, and part 2B is exactly the same, because what you're going to do now is you're going to pick up and knit stitches along each side of your main central Fair Isle square. Mine's just a small sample in terms of number of stitches, but I have knitted the same number of rows so that I can show you how to pick up your stitches and spread them out nice and evenly along the edges. And the square itself is also split into two parts. So we start with what's called an eyelet stitch pattern, and it's on a diagonal. And then the second part is another Fair Isle square, and I have a few tips for that square as well, because we have got on that square, we've got long sections of a single colour. So I'll show you how to strand your knitting across the back for those. So the pattern tells us to pick up and knit 59 stitches along the edge of your square. So what I'm going to do is I've got 3 pins here, just 3 regular dressmaking pins, and I'm going to split my the side of my square into 3 sections, roughly of the same number of rows. It doesn't have to be completely exact, but if you can get as near as possible to splitting it up into 4 equal sections, what you can then do to make sure that you spread your 59 stitches nice and evenly across the edge of the square, you're going to pick up almost the same number of stitches in each of those sections. We've got 59 stitches to pick up, and when you knitted your square, I think there's about 65 rows in total. So you're not picking up 1 stitch for every row of your square. You're going to have to miss a stitch. So again, you need to spread out those stitches that you missed nice and evenly across the edge, so that everything's spread out nice and evenly and it's not going to bunch up in one part. And these pins are going to help you to just put the same number of stitches into each section. So just pop your pins evenly spaced apart so that your square edge is nicely spread into 4 sections of equal numbers of rows, thereabouts. And then we're going to start to pick up stitches. Now, just to explain, I'm using a circular needle because when I try to do the videos with regular knitting needles, they just bang on the table all the time and it's really annoying. So it's best if I use a circular needle. You don't have to do this, so just ignore my needles. It's just purely to help me to show you what to do. So we're going to take the yarn. Mine is the lovely mustard colour. I'm not going to put a slip knot onto my needle at all. I'm just going to take my needle. I'm going to put 15 stitches in this first section. Just move that out of the way. So I'm going to pop my needle into that end stitch, and what you're aiming to do along the edge of your work is to pick up the stitches along a really straight edge. So what I mean by that is find the edge, so find the line that you're going to follow. So you can either choose to go under the very end stitch, or you can go another strand under and go into the next stitch along. But whichever of those you choose, either under the end stitch or 1 strand down, so you're working into the middle of that stitch, whichever you choose, keep that straight line all along the edge. You don't go under the end and then on the next one go in the middle of the stitch, because that's going to give you an uneven line and you want it to be really nice and straight. And don't go just under 1 strand at the end either, because that is just going to make a great big hole. You can already see that would make a massive hole in your knitting, and you don't want that either. So always go under 2, and if you want to, you can go into that next stitch. The further in that you go, just bear in mind that the greater the seam is going to be. So if you go into the second stitch along into the centre of it, you're going to have all of that on the back of your knitting, whereas if you just go into like the edge stitch, so under that edge stitch, you're only going to have the edge stitch itself in the seam. So it's just a personal preference and you can choose. So we pop our needle into that first stitch, and then we take the yarn from the ball and we just pop it over like that, and then you can pull the needle and pull it through the yarn. It's a little bit like crocheting actually, so if you are a crocheter, you'll probably find this really easy. I'm going to go into the next stitch, and I'm just going under that very end stitch. Can you see the two strands of the stitch there? So now I'm going to bring the yarn around the needle and pull it through, and then just push it along. Don't worry if that first stitch is a little bit loose, you can tighten that up when you weave in the ends. Now I'm going to miss the next stitch, and I'm going to go into the next stitch, or under the next stitch I should say, and pull that through. I'm just going to do that all the way along, making sure that in this first section I only have 15 stitches. And so I've picked up my 15 stitches here, and can you see, I can take that pin out now, we don't need that one. This nice straight line that I was talking about, can you see where I've picked up my stitches? It's all lovely and straight, and that's what you're aiming for when you pick up your stitches. And so now I'm going to pick up another 15 stitches to the next pin. So now I've got 30 stitches and I'm at the midpoint of my square. So I just need to now pick up 29 stitches on the other side. So I'm going to do 14 stitches in the next section and then 15 at the end, just so that I've then got the 59 stitches that we need. And can you see this straight line that I've been talking about is becoming really visible now, and it's all lovely and neat at the edges. So you really don't need to worry if the edges of your square look a little bit messy, because they're going to get hidden once you pick up your stitches. And so there are my 59 stitches all along the edge in a lovely straight line. Just make sure you go right into the stitch at the end as well when you reach the end, and also try to avoid picking up 2 stitches in the same stitch, because again you'll get a visible hole. But where you've missed an odd stitch here and there, just to miss out those rows, you might see just a little gap, but once you start knitting that gap will go, so don't worry about those either. You can just see mine a little bit there, but they'll join up together, don't worry about that. And so now we're ready to start knitting the next motif. And this square is called Culcheth Linear Park. And what we're going to do first of all is to purl the first row, and every wrong side row that you work on is going to be purl, so that's really nice and easy. So we're going to purl this row ready so that we're starting the pattern on the knit row. So if we move on to the second row, this is the knit row, or the right side row, and this is where we're going to make the eyelets. So I'm just going to show you quickly how to do that in case you haven't done it before. The pattern starts right at the very beginning of the pattern repeat with knit 3. So we knit 3 stitches there. Then we're going to knit the next 2 stitches together. So we put our needle into 2 stitches, bring the yarn around, pull it through and take those 2 stitches off. So we've lost a stitch there. But what we're going to do now is bring the yarn forward between the needles, and then it just goes over the back ready to knit the next stitch. So I'll just take it back. The yarn is at the back, we're going to bring it forward between the needles, and then it just sits on top of the needle, so that when you knit the next stitch, you've made a yarn over. and it's there, it's the second stitch in, and there's a little hole underneath, and that's going to become the eyelet. So when you purl on the next row, you're going to have a hole in your knitting, and that is going to create these lovely holes in this diagonal eyelet. And so this is showing rows 1 to 10. You can see the nice diagonal rows of eyelet stitches. And then what you do is you're going to work that pattern repeat until you have 19 centimeters of knitting in this pattern. And you want to end, it doesn't matter which row that you end on in terms of the eyelet row, but always make sure you end with the right side facing, so you will always finish on a purl row. And remember that when you measure, you've got the row of stitches that's on your needle, so you want to make sure you include those when you measure your 19 centimeters. So just pop the measurement to the top of your knitting needle so that you capture that row that's on the needle, otherwise it'll be slightly longer than the 19 centimeters. And I'm just going to go straight on now to the next part of this square. I'm not going to knit the 19 centimeters, we'll just pretend that I have, and I'll switch to the two colours that are now used in the Fair Isle knitting. So like square 1, we've got this chart. So if you want to refresh on your Fair Isle, go back to square 1. The difference in this chart is that we are only using 2 colours throughout the whole chart. So that does make it quite a lot easier. So you can either wind your yarn onto a small ball like we did before, or sometimes what I do when I'm just using one colour throughout as my contrast colour is, instead of winding it into a small ball, I just cut about 5 meters of yarn off at a time, and then I'll just join it in when it runs out at the end of a row. Because what we're going to do is, we've got quite long stretches of knitting in a single colour in this chart. We're going to have the bits of knitting in between the chart end and the next chart beginning, and we're also going to have these long bits here which are within the pattern, and so we're going to have to twist our yarns every 2 or 3 stitches, or every 3 or 4 stitches, whichever you prefer. It's entirely up to you, but I just find it better if my yarn is just not on a ball at all, so that's why I just cut off about 5 meters of yarn at a time, and then it's easier to untangle and it's easier to twist that yarn over the main yarn after every 3 or 4 stitches. But I'll show you how to do that next. What I'm done is I've followed the chart until I'm at these middle stitches here where there are 5 stitches in one colour. So I'm just going to show you how to twist the yarn. So if you knit 3 stitches first of all, and then all as you do, quite simply, is to take your yarn that's not in use and twist it over the top, and then carry on with the number of stitches that you need to knit. And what that's done is it's trapped it, can you see, within the base of that yarn. So it's really easy to do that, but there are just a couple of things. You can sometimes see that yarn on the right side of your knitting, so just be careful you don't leave it too loose. And then also don't strand at the same point on every row. So if, for example, above this on the next row there would be another 5 stitches of yarn E, don't strand the yarn, or twist the yarn, sorry, in the same place. I would 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I would say, if I was on this side now, I would go knit, 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 and then I'd strand the yarn on that stitch there, so that it was not in the same place, because otherwise you end up with a line of that colour just peeping through, and you can see it if they're all in the same place. So just be wary of that. Just make sure that when you twist the yarns, when you're stranding over long sections of knitting, that you don't always twist in the same place. So Other than that, really, it's just exactly the same as the first square.